We also offer a variety of education programs catered to groups of all ages, and we have quite a few events coming up this summer. So please make sure to go and check out our website and see if there's anything else you might be interested in. So before we get started and before I hand it over to James, I just wanted to share this great opportunity with you all. So the Renton's History Museum is having a photo gallery exhibit that it goes from or it started back in June and it goes until July 31st. And I'm just going to read you a little blurb about it so I don't mess it up. But so it's called Facing the Inferno, the Wildfire Photography of Carrie Greer. It says, this exhibit features over 60 dramatic photographs taken by Carrie Greer, a photographer for the National and Interagency Fire Center based in Boise, Idaho. The drastic effects of the wildfires are becoming more far-reaching as global warming extends the fire season nearly year-round. Smoke from wildfires has national impact, and the fire themselves are devastating to wildlife and humans, as these stunning images demonstrate. Pritchard Gallery in Boise, Idaho organized the exhibit with the goal of helping propel a broader understanding and conversation of this volatile human nature dynamic. So with that, that is all I have for you, and I want to give the rest of the time over to James because he has a lot of stuff planned for us. So James, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and you should be able to get started.
All right, give me just 1 second.
Okay.
Pop my face up there too while I'm doing that so you guys can see who I am. So I'm guessing this is probably flipped again. There we go. So my name is James Dickinson. Thanks you guys for attending. I am a fire ecologist for the Bureau of Land Management. I actually work in a service first organization, which means that even though I work for BLM, I actually am responsible for Oregon and Washington BLM lands, as well as U.S. Forest Service Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington and Alaska. That's actually Region 10. Annalee asked me to sort of give you a little bit of background about my job and how I got here. And in the early 2000s, I started on a fuels crew with the U.S. Forest Service on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, and went back to graduate school and got my master's degree in fire ecology. I came back to the U.S. Forest Service on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest here in Central Washington and worked as a fire ecologist in one of our ranger districts. That was, 20 years ago, practically 15 years ago when I actually started permanent full-time. And in the meantime, I have spent a lot of time doing fire line work down here in the bottom left. A big part of fire ecology is fire science, and we're going to start with a little bit of that discussion. But more importantly, fire ecology is about the interactions between fire as a process and a disturbance and the environment or the ecosystem. And so the bottom right picture there is work that, excuse me, not work. It's a landscape picture from the Okanagan-Wenatchee, just sort of demonstrating, the impacts that fire has in its role in the landscape. And so that's the focus of this talk. As my career has developed, and actually just about a year ago now, just before the coronavirus hit, I had the opportunity to travel to Tanzania as part of the U.S. Forest Service, where we have international programs. And part of that program is to share knowledge and experience with local collaborators who are trying to help with conservation efforts. And this particular project in Tanzania on the east side of Africa is working with the Maasai village to essentially help them understand their grazing processes, the impacts that that's having on their hydrology. They have really sensitive soils there and outrageous rainstorm events that, 2.5, 3 inches of rain in an hour, during their shoulder rainy seasons and even more during their heavy rain season. And my job or my role in that project is actually to help establish a fire management program with them so that they can understand how to use fire to promote grasses for their cattle, which is their livelihood, as well as to protect their lands from wildfires, which are human caused exclusively and tend to come in and burn in a huge area in their grazing landscape. So they have pressure from overgrazing and they have pressure from fire that are impacting their livelihoods. And so my job is to help them understand those issues and start figuring out a way that they can start managing their landscape with fire as a part of it to promote grass growth, but also to push back shrubby woody encroachment, which is shrub encroachment, ultimately trees, and the acacia trees in the background are ultimately what some of that ecosystem will convert back to. So I'm gonna switch gears here and I'm gonna do something that I've never done for a presentation, which always makes for exciting times. Hopefully you guys can see a screen that says Firefax, is that correct?
No, I'm just seeing your PowerPoint right now still.
Okay, let me reshare then. Stop sharing. You would think that after a year and a half of doing teleworking that I would have all of this stuff really memorized. All right.
We all fall into these issues every once in a while.
So I want to start out by giving a lot of credit where credit is due. So the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is one of a number of consortiums throughout the United States where their job is to help facilitate communication of fire and fire information as it relates to fire science and fire ecology. And they did a fantastic job of pulling together what they call their Firefax story map. And I'll provide the link to Anna Lee a little bit later so that you guys can access it because there's some really good, useful information in here. But what this does is it does a great job of presenting the basic information and the basic concepts of fire as a process, as a chemical process, how that interacts with the environment in terms of fire behavior, and then how that interacts with the basics of how that interacts with vegetation, and it moves us through fire management. So I was asked to provide some idea of fire management, and there's going to be a lot of terms that some of you have heard in the news, and it'll provide some context for you. And then I'll move on to a second, that PowerPoint presentation where I'll speak more specifically to fire ecology. And we'll take a short break in between those two parts. That being said, it's a fairly small group. Just when I switched over here, I just saw that there's 3 attendees. So if there's something you have a burning question about, feel free to ask it, and let's take the time to kind of work through it. If we start getting pressed for time, we'll hold questions till the end if that works for everybody. So wildland fire and fire in the West are a common occurrence. Historically, much more acreage burned on an annual basis. The difference being that fire in the ecosystem was interacting on a regular basis, and it was essentially controlling itself to some extent. You didn't have 2.5 million acres a year burning without running into other areas, and essentially that changes the fire behavior. When we talk about wildland fire, essentially a wildland fire is anything that's happening in vegetation. We in the fire organization, differentiate between structure fire, which is homes and buildings and urban types of responses, and wildland fires, anything that's happening in natural vegetation, and that can include even grass and brush fires in the median of the I-5 corridor, for example. That counts as a wildland fire because the tactics are different in terms of how we approach it and what's actually burning. So the key components of fire, and you're going to see a couple of triangles in this presentation because fire people love triangles. It means we only have to remember 3 things. the fire triangle is composed of the oxygen leg, the heat leg, and the fuel leg. In order for the chemical combustion process to happen, you've got to have oxygen combining at the chemical level with fuels in a rapid oxidation process that generates heat, and that heat propagates the process forward. So within the fire triangle, what firefighters and fire managers do is we actually address the fuels component. And you're going to see, we'll talk a little bit about how we do that in wildland fire suppression and how we also do that when we talk about fuels management. There's three basic types of wildfire. The first is ground fires, which are sustained in the duff and litter, or even underground in some cases. You've got surface fire, which is what many of our ecosystems in the Western United States, the primary spread component is on the surface. And then you've got crown fires, which, as you can see from the picture, and as we all know, can be extremely destructive and extremely high intensity. Just to put it in context of the Shadow Nature Preserve, there are bog and peat fires that burn for months, I think even years at a time, where underground or under the surface, you basically have a spread of fire happening, and it's consuming those materials in a slow motion process of combustion. Alaska is another great example in the permafrost where that sort of combustion process is happening. But a majority in the Western United States, a majority of fire is surface fire and or crown fire. We talk about fire, one of the most obvious hazards and risks is actually smoke. And I love this story map, because the first thing it does is say, yes, prescribed fire smoke is far less hazardous than wildfire smoke. And that's true. It's because when we choose to do prescribed burning, we're actually doing it in at a time when the fuels are not combusting completely, and they're not combusting at such a fast rate. And so what you get is a much cleaner, less polluting smoke. And it's also typically those prescribed burns are done so that we're trying to keep smoke out of air sheds, out of urban centers and towns. Wildfire smoke contains a bunch of fine particles that can lodge in the lungs that can actually get into your bloodstream. They contain a majority of smoke that we see when we see smoke columns are water vapor. And then there's some pretty toxic and nauseating gases. And then a bunch of fine particles, the pieces of uncombusted, microscopic uncombusted particles that are going up with that column, with that movement of air. Some of the issues are that the pollutants can actually exacerbate and create health issues in in people who have are compromised in their respiratory system, asthmatics, people with poor circulation. Those things can create a lot of problems. And as we're seeing in the news, those smoke particles, smoke itself can travel a long ways. So we're seeing smoke from the fires out west that is, making, I believe it's rating as hazardous smoke air conditions in Baltimore was the last one I saw. And you guys all saw this, I think it was a little bit last year and definitely the year before. So fire history in the Western US is complicated. This is a map of fire history, just contemporary fires for the last 20 years, based on, which is where we have good mapping, I guess is the best way of putting it. We have both satellite mapping, and we also have, the advent of GIS, where these fire perimeters are much more accurate. We also are doing much better job in the last 15 to 20 years of keeping track of all of our fires in terms of databases and information. But you can see that it's a really extensive history, and depending on where you're at, east of the Cascades especially, and all the way over into central Montana or western Montana, you can see the extent and the amount of fires, and that those fire sizes are increasing. over time. So we are seeing a lot more fire than we had in 1980 as a result of a number of factors. So fire behavior is an interesting topic, and it's important for the discussion about fire ecology. Here's another one of our triangles. So fire behavior is dictated by topography, weather, and fuels. The fuel component obviously is anything that any biomass in the forest or in the wildlands. So anything that's out there that, you know, conceivably release energy when it burns, it has the opportunity to burn in the right fire conditions. Tree crowns will combust. They take a lot of energy and they will combust and they will fully consume. More often than not, what we see is high intensity fuels on the surface that scorch and either partially torch or just scorch and singe and kill the biomass, the foliage in the trees. And the result is that either the high intensity fire around the base of the tree, if it had high intensity fire, it'll girdle the ability for the tree to pull up resources, or it will kill the foliage. And if the tree can't recover enough foliage to continue with photosynthesis in the next year or two, then it will typically die. Weather is a huge part of the fire behavior triangle. It's the most dynamic component, and this is the part that makes it firefighting extremely challenging, wildland firefighting. The wind is the primary concern. So wind not only increases the amount of oxygen that's applied to the fire, so it makes it actually burn more intensely by providing more of that fire triangle on that leg, but it also makes the fire spread much more rapidly in the direction that the wind is blowing. And it can loft embers into the air when embers are available. That usually happens as a result of tree torching, or certain fuel types will create opportunities for the wind to grab embers of burning material and loft them away, you know, downwind, which can take it across fire control lines. Air temperature and relative humidity. Oh, the other thing that wind does is also dries out fuels. It helps to basically it creates a convection oven, whether it's normal wind or whether it's hot air being blown from the fire. So it'll help dry out the fuels in front of a fire or across a landscape. Air temperature and relative humidity are the next most important, and really what they do is they control the ability. If it's super hot out, there is it helps to preheat the fuels. Essentially, it helps to dry the fuels out. And relative humidity is the amount of moisture, relative amount of moisture that's in the atmosphere. And anything that's not a live piece of fuel, so a living shrub is pulling moisture through its roots into its leaves, and so it's maintaining somewhere between 60 and 120% of its moisture as material. And so the fire can come through, and if it preheats that and overcomes that moisture, it'll combust that shrub. Dead fuels, on the other hand, they respond almost exclusively to the relative humidity. And so the amount of moisture that's in the air is the amount of moisture that wood can absorb. So the higher the relative humidity, the better the firefighting conditions, because the dead fuels are slightly less receptive to combustion. Precipitation is kind of an obvious one. It not only does it help to wet down the fuels, it also reduces the amount of directly, hitting the fuels. It wets them down, and so it actually creates a barrier between oxygen, the fuel, and the flame, the oncoming flame. In addition, it also helps to actually increase the fuel moisture itself, so that the dead wood itself is more challenging. It doesn't burn as effectively or as completely. There's more moisture to overcome by the heat. Atmospheric stability is a big one too. We had that heat dome over the top of us. We had extremely high temperatures, and we had extremely dry fuel conditions. But what we didn't have was, what we did have was atmospheric stability. And what that means is that the atmosphere is sitting on top of the fire, sort of like a lid on a stove. And it helps to prevent as much air coming into that fire as when the atmosphere is unstable. So when the atmosphere is unstable, the smoke column can basically push through into the unstable air. And what it does is it creates a chimney effect. And so you get air pulling in from the bottom of the fire, around the fire, pulling through. And it essentially is a chimney that increases the amount of wind and oxygen available to the fire. So we get, with low atmospheric stability, we have more of a chance of these fires columning out and fire intensity increasing, even without environmental winds that we just talked about. So it's essentially creating its own wind that's sucking in. And as we saw on the bootleg fire and has been reported in the news, the bootleg fire actually was able to break through the atmospheric stability, and it created its own thunderhead, essentially, that was actually flashing lightning out in front of the fire as a result of those same meteorological processes, but they're being influenced and driven by the heat and energy within that fire. Topography is the third leg of the fire behavior triangle, and it's the one that stays the same, right? Topography doesn't change very much, certainly not on a day-to-day basis, but it's what fire responds to on the surface. So fire always moves uphill unless it's influenced by wind. And so the components of topography that we're going to cover, slope is a big one. So the steeper the hill, the faster the fire can move uphill. And the result, or the mechanism for that, is essentially a preheating process where the flame is laying closer to the slope as it's moving uphill, and it's helping to preheat the fuels, and it's moving uphill into those preheated fuels as it moves. Aspect is another component of topography, and aspect controls the amount of natural heating that occurs. So if you're a south aspect or a southwest aspect, you get much more sun, and hence preheating of fuels at the prime burning period of the day, that when the temperature is the warmest and the weather is the most unstable in the late afternoon. In contrast, on a north aspect, you tend to have more vegetation. It tends to be a little bit more moist, and there's less preheating of fuels from direct solar influence. Elevation is an important component because, as you all know, the lowlands tend to be fairly dry as they come out of spring earlier, or out of winter earlier, and they dry out more as the summer goes along, and they're usually the last to get the precipitation and change of weather in the fall and winter. At elevation, you tend to have different fuel types, but you also have you have moisture in the system for a longer period of time. So snowpack adds to that. Vegetation greens up later, and so it's still peaked out at the amount of moisture that's in the live fuels, and it tends to be a much shorter season at higher elevations. So you guys are probably familiar with at least seeing red flag warnings coming from, or hearing about red flag warnings coming from the National Weather Service. There's two versions of these warnings that we get from the Weather Service. The first is a red flag warning, and that is essentially that the forecasted conditions are such that fire behavior or fire control is dangerous. It essentially means that we know that in the next 24 hours there's going to be enough low RH, low relative humidity, and high winds to make fire control an issue. In the buildup to that, sometimes they'll provide a fire weather watch, which is more of a preview of, hey, we think our forecast is going to include these conditions, so be heads up. And so for you guys in the public not doing wildland firefighting, fire weather watches are good times to pay attention if you've got plans to go out in the woods and do something fun, or go out in the parks and have a campfire, that type of thing. And fire red flag warnings are you should definitely not be doing that if you're not in an approved site with plenty of water. So fire intensity versus fire severity. This is going to be an important concept that we'll revisit in the next segment as well. Fire intensity is the amount of heat energy that's released at a specific place on the perimeter of a fire, or where you've got fire burning. It's an amount of energy that's being released, and that directly relates to fire effects. So from a fire ecology standpoint, that means that high intensity fires are much more likely to affect the environment in a generally negative way, and low intensity fires are not. From a fire control standpoint, high intensity fires mean that you can't be right next to the fire when you're trying to do fire suppression. You can't stand next to it. It's just too hot. It will burn you from a distance. That picture that I showed in my introductory slide of that fire in the lower left corner, that was uncomfortable to stand next to if you were anywhere closer than about 20-25 feet. Beyond that, it was warm, but it wasn't uncomfortable. So low intensity fires typically occur in cool, moist, and or low fuel conditions. And it's a result of the fire basically doesn't have enough combustible material to burn with releasing a lot of energy at one time. So the moisture content, which we've already talked about, helps to control how hot those fuels burn, but also the amount of fuels that are on the ground. And so they can and are used in prescribed fire context and even wildfire context. They will promote some thinning in small trees. They will help reduce understory fuels, as well as some some ladder fuels. And Ponderosa pine forests are a great example of these park-like stands that you can see here, where it's just a 1 to 2 foot flame length, and the fire typically spreads at a really reasonable rate of spread. And in contrast to high intensity fires, which are what we call crown fires, where the tallest, in this case trees, fuel is combusting, and the amount of energy that comes out of these is spectacular. It can't even be described. You can hear fires that are burning like this. They sound like a freight train. And somebody told me that when I was young in my career, and I didn't quite get it until I had the opportunity to hear it. And the only way to describe it is like listening to a freight train in the distance, if everything's going well. High intensity fires don't have to be crown fires. So when there's a lot of down fuel, like in a logging unit where they haven't cleaned stuff up, or where there's been a blowdown event and there's a lot of large fuels and high quantities of it, that can be a high intensity fire. And it's the same thing. You can't be next to them, and you have to actually work away from them. High intensity fires have typically have the most damage associated with them, whether it's soils or vegetation. They're definitely hard to control. And a great example is the West Side Forest that you guys live in and around. They're very high intensity fires, and to be safe from something like this, you have to be several hundred yards away. So fire severity, then, as I mentioned, is closely related to it, and it describes the degree to which fire is impacting the vegetation and soil. There's different ways of measuring it, whether you're looking at vegetation and the mortality of vegetation, which I will speak to mostly in my next segment. But there's also severity is also measured in the damage that it can do to soils. So where you have high intensity fire that is staying in one place for a long period of time, it can actually damage the soils and the not only the structural characteristics of the soil, but also the nutrient and mineral content of the soil. And the agencies, the land managers, we typically measure both of these, and our restoration actions after fires are based on both of these measures of severity. Positive impacts of fire, obviously, is revegetation of desired species. Sometimes that has to be promoted via planting. Other times it happens naturally. Well, I can cover that a little bit more in the next section. It also creates or improves wildlife habitat. So high severity fires actually create some habitat for blackback woodpeckers. Is kind of the shining example of a species that uses stand replacing fire. And low and mixed or low and moderate severity fire also have a lot of benefits for soil nutrient recycling, as well as vegetation regrowth and I'll just stick with regrowth. Negative impacts of fire and the fire severity, obviously, as I mentioned, the soils can lead to soil erosion and stream riverbank sedimentation as a result, and it can compromise drinking water. Also, it can facilitate a change in the ecosystem type. If the soils are such that the existing forested ecosystem can't make a living, then basically that soil starts from scratch and starts over and becomes, goes through a whole long series of successional phases. And sometimes what that means is that you end up with a different ecosystem there as a result of how that new area, highly impacted area, might actually recover. So here's an example of a burn severity map. And what I wanted to just point out here is that the greens are low severity or non-burned areas. The red is high severity, where the soils were damaged by the fire, and then yellow is kind of in between those two. It's a moderate severity, so it's still functional and is holding together, but it's been affected. But what I wanted to point out about this map is that within any typical fire perimeter, there's a range of effects that happen, in this case to soils, but also to vegetation. And there's areas, sometimes a lot of areas and sometimes not very many areas, but there are areas that haven't been burned, and those are important for ecology and for fire ecology. And if you guys were wondering, that's the Eagle Creek fire that happened back in 2015, I think it was, in the Columbia River Gorge. So fire management is the next topic here, and this is essentially the management of fire. In this particular context, this story map is placing it in the suppression side of the world. So when we're dealing with wildfires, fire management sometimes, or maybe even frequently, is intermingled with fuels management, which is the next section. And the reason for that is that fire is fire, whether it's wildfire or whether it's prescribed fire. And we pretty much do very similar things, just with different objectives in mind. So top priorities for wildland fire, when a fire happens and we mobilize resources to go deal, the first and foremost is public and firefighter safety. And there's no reason for us to engage in a wildland fire except to save somebody else's life. The public's a public's life, a person of the public, and keep them safe. And second most important is to keep our firefighters safe. I just can't stress that enough, the importance of that. And so I'll bring that back up a little bit later. The next priorities are defending communities and infrastructure, private property, especially, developments, homes, to some degree, private timberlands and private property as well, just in vegetation. Protection of critical natural resources is up there on our list, as well as allowing fire to interact with the landscape where we can. And that's a change in sort of the approach to fire. What we're recognizing is that there's such a deficit of fire across the Western United States that we need to get fire re-engaged with the environment. And what we need to do is allow it to burn. And ideally that's happening in relatively benign conditions. And the policy has been in effect for years now, and fire managers and fire suppression specialists are actually getting pretty good at managing wildfires for benefit of reducing fuels and reducing ladder fuels and getting fire back into the ecosystem. And we do that through a variety of mechanisms. One of those mechanisms is essentially using prescribed fire, the intentional ignition. We call them burnout operations, where instead of letting a fire burn out of control and set itself up to do high intensity fire runs of fire uphill, what we do is we actually take the time and the effort to keep that fire so that it doesn't have the opportunity to make uphill runs and have it be higher severity. So a couple of terms that are useful. I want to start with that one. The first one's containment. That's the one that gets reported in the news a lot. And containment is essentially how much of the fire do you have a controllable line, a controllable fire line around. And when I talk about fire line, what I mean is fire suppression in the wildland environment is all about removing fuels from being consumed. So a little tiny grass fire line means that you're putting, taking a shovel or a Pulaski, a chopping tool, and you're digging down to mineral dirt and you're putting a ring around that fire. When that ring is around that fire, you have 100% containment on the fire. In larger fires or more complex fuel types, a fire line can consist of having to cut down trees, having to use a bulldozer to get through duff and litter down to mineral soil, and it can be fairly large depending on the fire fuel type and where you are. But containment is about, do you have a line that separates the flaming fire from the non-burning material? Fire perimeter is obviously just the edge of the fire, where it's burning and where it's spreading. So it's that outside perimeter of the fire. And containment and control are oftentimes confused. And control is, when a fire is controlled, it means that you have full containment of the fire, and you also have enough confidence in that containment that it is controlled. You don't expect it to go anywhere. And so with these large fires, it takes quite a while to get containment. But then once you have containment, it takes a while to actually deal with the stuff that's burning right next to the line and in a certain distance. And once that is secure and solid and we feel good that it's not going to go anywhere, then we would declare a fire to be 100% controlled or controlled. And a mop-up is what I was just saying, where at some point you can actually, when fire behavior has subsided enough, we actually go in and begin putting out all of those hot spots. Anything that's got flame, that gets put out first. After that, anything that's got just little smoke things flying up, rising up, we put that out. And then we patrol that, and we make sure that there's no opportunities for anything to flare back up and turn into an active fire. And finally, calling a fire out is typically on a large fire, it basically is at the end of the year when you have snowpack and you have rain, in late fall is when people start thinking about calling things out. That being said, some of the fires in Western Oregon from the Labor Day event last year were actually still burning this spring. We were still dealing with some of that in those environments. Fuels management, like I said, is it's the proactive side of fire management. So fuels management's about how do we reduce fuels for objectives, for example, protecting homes and communities, and how do we how do we also get fire back into the ecosystem so that it's burning as it would characteristically in those ecosystems. Fuel types are important in that they define what kind of fire behavior there's going to be. The amount of fuel availability is important because even though there's fuels on the ground, they may not be available to burn because of their shape and size and moisture content and density. In reality, pretty much fuel is fuel. It's available to burn. It just depends on how long and how fast it might burn. So fuel availability is a big thing, but fuel loading is a measure of how much fuel is on the ground, and is a direct estimate, or provides a direct estimate of how intense a fire is going to be based on generic burning conditions. So all three of these are given consideration when we're talking about doing fuels management and prescribed fire. Talking about the fuels, we already mentioned there's ground fires. So if there's ground fires, then there must be ground fuels, meaning there must be things underground that are, or under the surface, I should say, that are able to burn. Bog and peat fires or tundra fires are a great example. There's all kinds of biomass in there, and they have the ability to burn. And when fire is introduced to it and it gets established, it will burn through ground fuels. And this is why, just point this out, this is why fire lines have to go to mineral soil. It's so that when the fire gets to that fire line, it hits mineral soil, which doesn't burn, versus duffing or creeping its way through ground fuels. A single root is a great example. A single root can actually carry fire across a fire line and make you lose control or containment on that fire. Surface fuels are anything that's on the surface. This is a great diagram. Ladder fuels are the small trees, shrubs, intermediate understory. If for those of you who are forestry oriented, it's the understory that provides ladder fuels into the canopy fuels, which are the dominant trees or the dominant life form on that landscape. Crown fuels can technically apply to grass fires, because when you have a grass fire, it's a stand replacing event. You're killing all of the grass, at least killing all of the biomass of the grass. So it's moving through the crowns of grass. Fuel moisture content, we kind of talked about it with the relative humidities, but essentially it's the amount of water that is in the fuel. It determines how readily that fuel will burn, how fast it will burn, and with what intensity. And it is it's what we use to predict fire behavior. As they point out over here, when fuel moisture content is high, fires don't ignite easily because the energy is used to drive the water out of the plant instead of burning through the plant. And that's the great explanation of it. When fuel moistures are low, then all of that carbon essentially is available for release in the combustion process. And that's how you get fire as a chemical process. So why would we manage fuels? Well, the short answer for me, being a manager, is because that's the only thing that we can control when we talk about getting fire back into ecosystems or protecting homes. The only thing we can control and that we can readily manipulate is the fuels that are on the ground. Reducing fuels helps lower fire intensity. It makes it less likely that fire will damage structures or people. It helps to make operations safer for everybody. So doing wildland fire suppression, it gives us an opportunity to rely on places that have low fire behavior or minimal fire behavior, which is what we would call an anchor point. It allows us to build off of that and have a location of known quantity in terms of fire behavior and work around or work with to help corral and control wildfires. How do we manage fuels is pretty simple. It's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So handwork, lop and scatter is a common one, and that's where you would go in perhaps and thin out a bunch of understory trees, and you just leave them on the ground, or you would scatter them in some cases if you're pruning them. Machine piling, or large and small machines. Mowers, chippers, masticators are less common in a lot of fuel treatments, but they are a treatment that get used quite a bit. And more often than not, we see these actually on wildfires where we're trying to build control lines, control features, because we can quickly move through with minimal exposure to firefighters and get a lot of work done very quickly and manipulate those fuels. Piling, anything, any sort of any sort of mechanical treatment where we're using a chainsaw or clippers in some cases, treatments will strive in most cases to pile that material if there's enough of it. So you pile it and then you burn those piles, and that fuel has been removed from that area of treatment. Compared to the lop and scatter example before, you would apply that in the situation where the fuels that you're creating through your mechanical action aren't enough to create any sort of a control or unnatural fire behavior. So where you're generating low amounts of fuel, you do a lop and scatter. Where you have more fuel than you want to see on the ground for maintaining the integrity of that treatment unit, you would pile them and then you would burn them. And then prescribed fire, obviously. Pile burns count as prescribed fire, but prescribed fires are controlled burns where our experienced firefighters, essentially, we have a limited number of tools that allow us to predict fire behavior, and they build prescriptions, weather prescriptions. So you have a window of weather opportunities and fuel conditions. And when you're able to achieve those weather and fuel conditions, then you intentionally put fire on the ground in a controlled manner. And we control fire, loosely speaking, we control fire by using unique ignition patterns on the landscape. So we are able to apply fire in such a way as to minimize the fire effects throughout a burn unit. And that is a very interesting topic in its own, but a little bit beyond what we can do, what we can talk about here. Prescribed fire, as I mentioned earlier, produces far less smoke because of not because of air quality standards, but because managers are trying to keep that smoke from going into communities, so it doesn't pool up overnight in the inversion layer. But also, prescribed fires happen at times of year where ventilation, where the amount of smoke going into the air as a result of the minimal fire behavior, but also as a result of the weather conditions, that smoke gets up and gets dispersed, and so there's far less of it in concentrations. The smoke itself is also less hazardous because we're using lower intensity fire, and because we're not getting complete combustion of fuels. We're reducing them, 50 to 80%, but we're not reducing them 90 to 100% in a number of hours. We're reducing them 50 to 80% over a number of days. So the smoke is and the combustion process is less complete. Prescribed fire is intended to lessen the risk of damage from severe wildfire or untreated units as a result of wildfire. It helps kickstart fresh growth. It maintains conditions that many fire-dependent plant and animal species rely on. And it also increases community and firefighter safety, as I mentioned. This story map has a great video here that I'd recommend you guys watch. I'm not going to play that. It's about 6 minutes, and I encourage you to watch it. The role of people in ecosystems and also their use of fire over millennia is not ignored either. The first peoples, First Nations, or the indigenous peoples of North America used fire, especially in the West, extensively for food and for other cultural values. And many of the ecosystems that we recognize today as a result of their interactions, their historical interactions with the ecosystems and using fire. Those ecosystems have co-evolved over those thousands of years to actually be what we recognize as ecosystems. And we have, from a philosophical standpoint, we have no way of separating their, the First Peoples, First Nations role in fire and how they shape the ecosystems. But their whole cultures, many of their cultures are based around the interactions with fire and what fire does when it interacts with the ecosystem. It replenishes, huckleberries is a really common, was a really common use, but also grasses and shrubs, as well as trees. They used it to promote travel, and they did it at very explicit times, as dictated by their traditions. And ultimately, those resulted in ecosystems that are adapted to fire. These four people, I don't know this first one. Ernesto Alvarado is a researcher at University of Washington. Blanking on names here. Steve Rigdon is with the Yakama Nation here in Eastern Washington. And then Cody DeSoto is part of the Colville Nation. And all I'm assuming all four, but those three are thoroughly engaged in fire and natural resource management, throughout their lands, as well as many of the federal and state lands. And their insight and their approach to resource management is unique and extremely valuable. So wildfire preparedness obviously is being prepared for wildfires. Human caused fires, getting an exact number for this is a little bit challenging, but the numbers are anywhere between 90 and 96%, 97% I think is the highest one I've seen, caused by human ignition, human carelessness in this case. So it's fires that are happening as a result of, the lawnmower striking a rock, or a chainsaw without a spark arrestor, or somebody lighting a campfire someplace they shouldn't have. And so being aware of what and how fire affects the environment and people is important. Those interactions often happen in the wildland urban interface. And before I cruise through this, I just want to point out that we've got that big fire in the background on this screen, but I think there in the foreground, you can see more fire just beyond those white buildings on the right-hand side. You can see that was actually a fire as well that just burned recently. Wildland urban interface is a real challenge. It's the definition, or the definition of wildland urban interface is really natural and man-made fuels and interactions with what we would call society, right? So roads, communities, individual houses, we generally just call that wildland urban interface. And as I mentioned, the priorities for wildfire managers, fire managers, is human safety, and it's extremely challenging as our communities and cities spread into the wildland. It becomes increasingly challenging and expensive to suppress fires in those areas. And on top of that, it also increases the amount of ignitions that we see from human-caused fires. It's determined by type and distribution of vegetation and proximity of structures, climate, weather and patterns, fire history, topography and access are all components of what make fighting fires there challenging. There's a map here that helps you understand sort of what is considered wildland urban interface. As I mentioned, it doesn't take a lot of human density really to complicate the natural environment and cause people to call it WUI, or wildland urban interface. I'm not going to zoom in, but I thought I'd move it to where you guys are. So what can you do? What can your community do? There's a lot of great resources. Firewise USA is a program for helping residents reduce wildfire risks. There's a couple of links here that we can follow. And I'm gonna show you a different link here in a second, but Firewise is essentially a program that teaches residents how to minimize the risk of their structure being lost in a fire if you live in that environment. And there's no guarantees that a structure will survive any fire at any given point in time, regardless of how good you do. So living in the wildland urban interface requires people to acknowledge that there is a risk that they will lose their house, despite best efforts by everybody. Fire adapted communities is a new concept, or I guess an extension of the Firewise principle, where essentially what we're trying to do is get communities and subdivisions and urban or semi-urban areas to recognize that there's actions they can do around their community itself to facilitate protection from wildfire. So there's some aspects here. I'll just quickly cruise through. Community protection box in the top left, creating fuel breaks out a distance from the community, just 100 feet type of range where you've reduced the surface fuel, you reduced the risk of ground fire by removing ladder fuels and surface fuels. Access is important. The better the access to a community or to a home, the better and more defensible it is for fire managers, fire personnel to get in and try and protect and do last minute preparation around your house. Evacuation also is a big part of that, understanding where to go if a fire is in different locations. And it goes with the access piece, because people evacuating from a community can complicate the response time and the ability of fire personnel to respond to fire. Having a home, your built environment protected against or more protected against wildfire, metal roofs, no wood piles next to the house, good vegetation around the house, grass, green grass lawns, those kinds of things all help to ensure that fire doesn't actually reach your house. But that's not to say that some random ember isn't going to land in some random place that somebody wasn't able to clean out and get an opportunity to start a fire, which is why I say there's no guarantees that your house will survive a wildfire. Defensible space is the last piece, and that I've already hammered on that, so I don't need to talk about it. The Ready, Set, Go program is the one I was going to show you, and let's see if, yeah, cool. So this is a 7-week program to help fire-proof, and I use that loosely, but to help minimize the risk of your home to fire. And I just wanted to point this out because it's a great resource where it gives you a step-by-step how to do this. Landscaping, what kinds of plants, what kinds of things can you plant next to your home, and it helps you basically build a Firewise home and property. And so I recommend taking some time and looking into this stuff. There we go. And going back to this. Lastly, I wanted to just take a second, make sure I cover everything so Firewise. So there's some resources in the story map. And last thing I want to do is just take a second to acknowledge the folks who developed this, since I was not the person that developed it, and I greatly appreciate having it as a tool. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and invite any questions or thoughts or topics. Again, there's going to be a second section that's more oriented towards fire ecology, the interaction of fire with the environment. But I thought I'd take some questions here, and then we'll take a short break and then move into the next one. Are there any questions I can answer?
I actually had a question too, just curious. So ground fire, how does that work? Does it just continue to burn just from the like organic matter and the oxygen, the dissolved oxygen that's in the soil? Or yeah, how does that keep going when it's underground?
So there is it's essentially an oxygen, it's essentially an oxygen limited environment. So it has enough oxygen to burn, but it doesn't have enough oxygen to combust into flames, or it's so compacted that it can't. So it's basically a fuel density relationship, and so yeah, there's pores between soil and within that material, and that those porous spaces hold oxygen, and that's what it burns. But it's usually a low intensity, slow moving, but long duration fire, because there's usually a lot of material there.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
Is that, could I ask, is that related to, or is it the same thing as those coal seam fires in Pennsylvania that go on for years and years and years? And isn't that one of the major sources of pollution in some areas of the globe?
I can't speak knowledgeably to that. You know, I'm thinking of the one back in Pennsylvania that I've seen several Discovery Channel shows on. You know, I think a lot of the smoke is actually filtered pretty well as it's coming through in those coal seam type of fires. In ground fires, it's a source of persistent smoke pollution. I don't think that it's any greater than or more toxic, you know, more potent than a regular fire. It's funny, you know, I wasn't going to speak too much about I was going to kind of skip over the ground fires because we don't deal with them very often. And I was kind of going through my Rolodex of which I guarantee is small, my Rolodex of knowledge. And I was like, I haven't done a lot of reading about those because they're just so, we don't have that environment. But that being said, you know, on the Olympic Peninsula and in some of the west side forests, that duff and litter layer is so thick that we'll get a fire line around those if we're lucky. And then it takes forever to get those things to stop burning and to stop putting up smoke. And as long as they're burning underground, there's always that chance that it'll come up to the surface, reignite, torch a tree, and spot across the line. Are there any other questions? Jeez. All right. Annalee,